The summer of 1995. A searing California summer, yet in the secluded Vault Valley, time seemed suspended, measured by the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves and the chirping of birds. Until the day sisters Iva and Elizabeth, inseparable, hitched their delivery wagon and vanished. Their laughter faded, replaced by the heavy silence of absence. For nearly a decade, the conclusion was simple, though painful. They had run away, seduced by the intoxicating call of the modern world, that English life so feared by their Amish community. But the whispers ceased abruptly in 2004. Environmental workers inspecting abandoned mine shafts in the remote foothills made a grim discovery. Wedged deep in the earth's maw, far below the surface, lay the sisters' delivery wagon. This was no runaway. This was a violent end. The runaway theory shattered, broken by harsh reality. Yet the finding of the wagon only deepened the mystery, leaving behind a far more chilling question. If this was where their journey ended, where were the girls? Quillout. Her hands practiced, meticulously oiled the leather harnesses. The scent of neatfoot oil and old leather filled the barn, a familiar aroma that invariably conjured the memory of her daughters. Iva and Elizabeth had always handled the tack, their light laughter echoing against the rafters, their hands quick and sure. 9 years had passed since those echoes faded. 9 years since the girls, aged 19 and 23, had hitched the horse to the delivery wagon and simply dissolved into the California summer. Methodical and practiced, Quillout worked the oil into a dry martingale. The routine was a balm, a way to keep the overwhelming stillness at bay. The Vault farm, nestled in a secluded valley far from the coastal bustle, adhered to the old ways. Life was governed by the sun, the seasons, and the Ordnung, the set of Amish rules. But the disappearance had introduced a discordant note, a dissonance that had never resolved. The interruption came not as a sound, but a vibration in the earth, a low rumble distinct from the clip-clop of a buggy or the groan of farm equipment. Quillout paused, rag in hand. Walking to the barn door, she looked out across the dusty yard. A county sheriff's vehicle, stark white and jarringly modern, was crawling up the long dirt lane. It was an alien presence here. The English authorities rarely came onto the settlement lands unless summoned, and they hadn't been summoned today. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Wiping her oily hands on her apron, leaving dark streaks on the faded blue fabric, she stepped out into the sunlight to meet the car. A man climbed out, tall and angular, dressed in a rumpled suit that spoke of long hours. He removed his sunglasses, squinting against the glare. "Mrs. Vault. Quillout Vault?" She nodded, her throat tight.
Mrs. Vault? Quillout Vault?
She nodded, her throat tight. "I am she." "I'm Detective Vance Russo. I'm with the Major Crimes Unit." He paused. His expression, carefully neutral and professional, was softened by a flicker that looked like reluctance. "We need to talk about your daughters, Iva and Elizabeth." The names hung in the air, heavy and sharp, like freshly honed blades. "Have you found them?" The question was automatic, a reflex honed over nearly a decade of unanswered prayers and gnawing uncertainty. Russo looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting towards the foothills that rose sharply in the distance, a formidable barrier between worlds. "Not exactly, ma'am. But we found something. Something significant." He explained that state environmental workers had been conducting mandated inspections of abandoned mine shafts in those remote foothills. A recent scandal involving a leaking chemical cache in an old mine further north had forced a statewide survey of these historical sites. They were looking for contaminants, rusted equipment, anything that might pose an ecological threat. Deep in a narrow shaft designated only as Site 44B, the survey crew had found something wedged tight, far below the surface. It wasn't mining equipment. "It's a buggy, Mrs. Vault," Russo said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "A horse-drawn wagon. The description we have on file from 1995. It seems to match." The world seemed to tilt. A buggy. Their delivery wagon. The last tangible piece of their lives before the silence. For years, a faction within the community had whispered that the girls had simply run away, that the allure of the English world, the bright lights and forbidden freedoms, had seduced them. Quillout had never believed it. Iva and Elizabeth, with their bright blue eyes and steadfast faith, would never have left without a word. But the agonizing absence of evidence had allowed the narrative to fester, a poison seeping into the community's heart. "I must see it," Quillout said, the words surprising even herself with their unyielding firmness. The truth, however grim, was finally within reach.
"It's a difficult location, Mrs. Vault," Russo cautioned, his eyes scanning her simple attire. "Rough terrain, and the extraction is still in progress." "I must see it!" she repeated, her gaze unwavering, a quiet force against his professional restraint. "If it is theirs, I will know it." The elders would disapprove, she knew. Such involvement with the outside world, such immersion in the violence of the past. It was contrary to the principles of acceptance and forgiveness, to the quiet endurance expected of her. But this was not about the community. This was about her children. Untying her apron, she let it fall to the dirt, a symbolic shedding of her daily duties. "Take me there! Now!" The drive was long and jarring. The smooth asphalt of the county road soon gave way to winding gravel tracks and finally to rutted dirt paths that seemed barely passable, the cruiser jostling and groaning in protest. The air conditioning, a strange artificial cold, felt alien against Quillout's skin. They traveled far from the familiar, ordered farmland, climbing steadily into the rugged, isolated mining territory. This was a landscape of scrub oak, dry creek beds, and forgotten history, a desolate place where secrets could be kept indefinitely. Russo was quiet, respectful of her silence. With her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Quillout watched the landscape transform, each mile deepening the chasm between her world and this one. The closer they got, the more the dread solidified into something cold and heavy in her chest, pressing down on her lungs. They arrived at the site, a hive of activity that contrasted sharply with the surrounding wilderness. Several official vehicles were parked haphazardly, their lights flashing silently. A large motorized rigging system, a skeletal tower of steel, had been erected over a gaping hole in the earth. Men in hard hats and reflective vests moved with grim purpose, their voices low and urgent. Russo guided her through the organized chaos toward the edge of the shaft. The opening was wider than she had imagined, perhaps 15 feet across, its edges crumbling and unstable, swallowing the light. "Be careful," he murmured, his hand gently on her arm. "Be careful, ma'am. Stay behind the tape." Ignoring him, Quillout moved right up to the boundary, her feet planting themselves firmly on the crumbling edge. She looked down. The shaft was a deep, cylindrical maw descending into absolute darkness, a hungry gullet carved into the earth. Sunlight penetrated only the upper portion, illuminating the rough, uneven walls of rock and compacted earth. And then she saw it. It was rising, slowly, jerkily, suspended by thick white ropes attached to its undercarriage, groaning against the strain. The sight was so grotesque, so profoundly wrong, that Quillout felt the breath leave her body, leaving her lungs hollow and aching. The buggy was unrecognizable at first glance. Skeletal and fragile, it was caked in thick layers of dried mud and grime that utterly obscured its original black color. It looked less like a vehicle and more like the carcass of some strange, forgotten beast dredged from a primordial swamp. The wooden wheels were weathered and severely damaged, spokes broken or entirely missing. The black vinyl of the seat was torn and shredded, its backrest tilted at an unnatural, agonizing angle. It hung suspended in the center of the shaft, rotating slowly in the abyss, a macabre pendulum. The ropes strained under the immense weight, the winch motor whining in protest, a mechanical lament. It was a moment that shattered the fragile hope, a structure painstakingly constructed over 9 agonizing years. The whispers, the theories, the agonizing possibility that perhaps somewhere they were alive, it all collapsed in an instant. This was not the aftermath of an escape. This was violence. This was disposal. The buggy cleared the lip of the shaft, dripping thick black mud. The rigging swung it over solid ground, and the smell that rose from it was overwhelming. Damp earth, decay, and the cold metallic scent of the subterranean world. It settled onto the ground with a sickening crunch of weathered wood, the sound echoing the finality of its impact. The forensic team immediately moved in, cameras flashing like predatory eyes. But Keelout was already moving toward the wreckage, drawn by an irresistible, visceral need to touch it, to confirm the horrifying reality that stood before her.
Detective Russo moved quickly to intercept her, stepping into her path.
Mrs. Vault, please. This is an active crime scene. You can't touch anything.
It is my property, Keelout stated, her voice flat but unyielding, a quiet decree against his authority. Pushing past him, her eyes already scanning the mud-caked wreckage, she ignored his protest. The forensic technicians exchanged uneasy glances, then stepped back, deferring to the detective, who merely watched Keelout with a complex expression. Circling the buggy slowly, Keelout absorbed the decay. 9 years of exposure, 9 years of the Earth's crushing weight had warped and distorted it. Yet the fundamental shape remained. Looking at the seating area, she imagined Iva and Elizabeth perched there, their blue and purple dresses vibrant against the black vinyl, their white bonnets crisp in the sunlight. The image was superimposed over the wreckage, a ghostly presence clinging to the ruined frame. Certainty was needed. The standard design of the buggies made them nearly indistinguishable to outsiders, but each one bore the unique, intimate marks of its owner, the small repairs, the modifications made over years of careful use. Ignoring the damp earth soaking into her dress, she knelt down to peer at the undercarriage, the complex network of springs and braces. The mud was thickest here, hardened like concrete, concealing everything. "I need this cleaned," she said, her finger pointing to the rear axle brace, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Ma'am, we have to process the scene exactly as it is," one of the technicians protested gently, gesturing with a gloved hand. "Russo," Keelout said, not looking up, her command clear. "Clean it." Russo nodded at the technician, his earlier caution giving way to an understanding of her profound need. "Do it carefully. Document everything first." The technician, with of professional resignation, used a fine brush and a spray bottle of water to slowly loosen the hardened mud. The process was agonizingly slow, each careful stroke revealing a fraction more of the grim truth. Keelout remained kneeling, motionless, her gaze fixed on the emerging metal, and then she saw it. It wasn't a manufacturer's mark, it was a weld, a rough, uneven seam of metal where the brace had fractured and been repaired years ago by her husband, Jacob. A repair only she, and perhaps Jacob, would recognize. She reached out, her finger hovering just above the ugly weld. "My husband, Ephraim, he did this the summer before." Her voice faltered, a veil of sorrow descending with the words. "The brace broke when he hit a washout on the lower road. He was not skilled with the welding torch the English use, but he borrowed one. He was proud of the repair, though it was ugly." It was a detail so specific, so intimate that it could not be mistaken. A mark that had never been included in the original police report because who would have thought to mention an ugly weld?
Russo knelt beside her, his eyes piercing through the rust to examine the metal scar. He looked up at Quilla, his expression grim. "You're sure?" "It is theirs," she whispered. The confirmation brought no relief, only a profound, crushing weight. The buggy in the mine shaft was a silent tombstone, even if it held no bodies. Russo stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. He turned to his team, his voice firm but contained. "All right, positive ID. This is officially the VA cold case. Proceed." He paused, then spoke louder. "Process everything. I want soil samples from the interior, paint analysis, trace evidence. Tear this thing apart." As the team resumed their work with renewed intensity, Russo spoke quietly with Quilla. The initial search of the mine shaft, conducted by the specialized team even before the buggy was fully extracted, had yielded nothing else. No human remains, no clothing, no personal items. The buggy was the only thing there, swallowed by the earth. The agonizing question, the one that had tormented Quilla for 9 years, now sharper than ever. If the buggy was here, where were they? The absence of remains felt like a cruel joke, a denial of closure. The drive back to the settlement was heavier than the journey out. The reality of the discovery settled over Quilla like a shroud. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley as they approached the vault farm. News of the discovery had spread quickly, likely relayed by Russo to the local sheriff, who maintained contact with the community leaders. The quiet lanes of the settlement were unusually active. People stopped their work to watch the cruiser pass, their faces a mixture of shock, grief, and apprehension. Upon returning home, the dormant sorrow of the past 9 years was violently awakened. The farm felt emptier than before. Ephraim had passed away 3 years prior, his heart broken by the uncertainty. Quilla was alone with this devastating truth.
That evening, the elders came to her home. Bishop Yodar and 2 deacons sat stiffly in her living room, a room furnished with simple, handcrafted wooden furniture. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "Sister Quilla," Bishop Yodar began, his voice grave, resonating in the silence. "This news, it has troubled the community deeply." "It is the truth," Quilla replied, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. "It is a truth that brings so pain and disruption," the bishop countered. "For 9 years we have prayed for acceptance. We have sought peace in the will of God. This involvement with the English authorities, this reopening of old wounds, it serves no purpose." Quilla looked at him, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. "My daughters were taken. Their buggy was thrown into the earth like refuse. This is not God's will. This is the work of man, evil work." "And what will you do, sister?" leans forward, one of the deacons asked, leaning forward. "Will you immerse yourself in the darkness? Will you seek vengeance? That is not our way." "I seek answers," Quilla said, her voice rising with unwavering purpose. "I seek to know what happened to my children, and I will not stop until I know." The bishop, a sound heavy with disapproval and resignation. "We urge you to reconsider. Accept the mystery. Find solace in prayer. Further involvement with the outside world will only bring more sorrow. It will distance you from your faith, from your people." The meeting ended with a strained prayer, the words feeling hollow in the face of Quilla's unyielding resolve. The conflict was stark, a chasm having opened between her commitment to the traditions of her faith and the desperate, primal need of a mother seeking justice. Isolation defined her now, not just by grief, but by a fierce determination. The community sought to absorb the shock, to smooth over the disruption, and to return to the familiar rhythms of their lives. But for Quilla, that was impossible. The discovery of the buggy was not an ending, it was a beginning. The silence had been broken, and the echoes from the shaft demanded a response.
A few days passed in a strange, suspended state. The discovery of the buggy had indeed brought the unwanted attention the elders feared. Local non-Amish news outlets picked up the story, the sensational angle of Amish sisters and an abandoned mineshaft proving irresistible. Reporters began to lurk on the edges of the settlement, their cameras and microphones intrusive and disrespectful. Disrupted by the constant presence of outsiders, the quiet rhythm of the community frayed, the tension palpable in the air. Quilla tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, tending to the farm, preparing meals she barely touched, praying for guidance, but the image of the wrecked buggy haunted her waking moments and invaded her dreams. She waited for updates from Detective Russo, but the investigation
moved with agonizing slowness. The forensic analysis of the buggy yielded little new information. Years of mud and decay had erased most traces of evidence. The community remained divided. Some offered quiet support, bringing food and condolences, their eyes reflecting their own fear and uncertainty. Others kept their distance, their disapproval evident in their averted gazes and hushed conversations. Increasingly isolated, Quilla felt caught between the world she knew and the dark mystery she was compelled to unravel. Then, the fragile peace shattered. It was a Tuesday evening, the air still warm from the day's heat. Zila Hotstetler, a young woman from a neighboring farm, was walking home from a quilting circle. Zila was 19, the same age Eva had been when she vanished. She was known for her gentle nature and her quick laughter, a bright presence in the community. The path she took was familiar, a narrow dirt road that wound through the dense cornfield separating the farms. The corn was high, creating a tunnel of green that muffled the sounds of the evening. The only light came from the rising moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Zilla was humming softly to herself when the silence was abruptly shattered by the guttural roar of an engine approaching fast from behind. She moved instinctively to the side of the road, assuming it was one of the local farmers returning late, but the vehicle was unfamiliar, a dark, heavy utility truck, its headlights blindingly bright, cutting through the twilight. The truck pulled up sharply beside her, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. Before Zilla could react, the driver's door flew open with a violent swing, and a man leaped out. He was large, heavily set, his face obscured by the deepening shadows and the merciless glare of the headlights. He moved with a brutal speed that paralyzed her with an ice-cold fear. Grabbing her arm, his grip like iron manacles, he violently attempted to force her into the vehicle. The attack was sudden and savage. Zilla screamed, the sound swallowed whole by the dense, whispering cornfields. "You think you're so pure," the man growled, his voice rough and laced with a bitterness that chilled her to the bone. "You're nothing but hypocrites. Get in the truck." The smell hit her then, a strong, pungent odor of yeast and stale beer clinging to his clothes, mixed with the sour scent of sweat. Zilla fought back with a desperate, unexpected ferocity. The terror that had paralyzed her transformed into a surge of primal adrenaline. Twisting in his grasp, she kicked wildly at his legs. Biting down hard on his hand, the coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. The man roared in pain and surprise, momentarily loosening his grip. Zilla wrenched her arm free and scrambled backward, stumbling on the uneven ground. She didn't look back, sprinting blindly into the dense cornfields, the sharp leaves lashing at her face and arms like whips. She ran, fueled by pure terror, the sound of the man shouting angrily behind her, echoing in the night. He pursued her for a few moments, crashing through the cornstalks, but the oppressive darkness and the dense tangle of the field made the chase difficult. He stopped, pruling violently, then retreated to his vehicle. Zilla heard the engine roar to life, the tires spinning on the gravel as he sped away, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness of the cornfield. She remained hidden for a long time, crouched low to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably, the profound silence of the night amplifying the frantic pounding of her heart. When she finally emerged from the field, she ran the rest of the way home, the familiar path now transformed into a landscape of terror. She arrived home hysterical, her clothes torn, her arms covered in scratches.
Terrified by her appearance and her frantic, fragmented story, her parents immediately sent for Quilla. Quilla arrived within minutes. The scene in the Hostetler farmhouse was chaotic. Zila was cooling uncontrollably, her words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. Kneeling beside her, Quilla felt her own heart pounding with a sickening dread. She gently took Zila's hands, her calm presence a steady anchor in the rising panic of the room. The community was paralyzed. The discovery of the buggy and this new attack suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The threat was not historical, buried in the past. It was immediate, active, and targeted. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into a wave of terror that engulfed the settlement. The sanctuary they had built was no longer safe. The attack on Zila Hostetler shattered any remaining illusion of safety within the Amish settlement. The following morning, Detective Russo arrived, the atmosphere far more charged than his previous visits. The elders, who had previously urged caution and non-involvement, were now demanding answers and protection. Quilla found herself in a crucial, if uncomfortable, position. Zila, traumatized and deeply distrustful of outsiders, refused to speak directly to Russo. She clung to Quilla, the shared experience of trauma creating an unspoken bond between them. This made Quilla the intermediary, the bridge between the terrified young woman and the determined detective.
They sat in the Hostetler's kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating the stark simplicity of the room. Gently, Quilla coaxed the details of the attack from Zila, translating her fragmented sentences and emotional responses into a coherent narrative for Russo. The description of the assailant was vague. He was English, non-Amish, heavy-set with rough hands, his face obscured by the darkness and the chaotic nature of the struggle. But the most distinct details were not visual, but sensory. "The smell," Zila whispered, her voice trembling. "It was strong, like the mash left over from brewing, sour, yeasty." Quilla felt a chill, despite the warmth of the room. The smell of yeast and stale beer. It was a distinct detail, unusual in their community where alcohol consumption was strictly regulated. "What did he say to you, Zila?" Quilla asked, squeezing her hand. Zila recounted the words, the phrases laced with bitterness and resentment. "He called me a fraud. He said we thought we were better, safe." She looked at Quilla, her eyes pleading for understanding. "He hated us. He hated who we are." This suggested a familiarity with the Amish lifestyle, a deep-seated animosity that went beyond a random act of violence. It wasn't just an attack, it was a targeted assault on their very identity. Russo noted everything, his expression unreadable. He assured the Hostetlers that patrols in the area would be increased, but the isolation of the settlement made constant surveillance impossible. The interview concluded. Russo left, promising to return the next day. The community was left to grapple with the chilling reality that they were being hunted. Walking home late that evening, Quilla found the darkness feeling oppressive, menacing. The familiar path seemed fraught with danger. Every shadow, every rustle of the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She reached her own farm, the house dark and silent. As she approached the front gate post, something caught her eye that hadn't been there when she left. It was a splash of white against the dark wood, an envelope nailed aggressively to the post with a large, rusted nail. Quilla's heart pounded against her ribs. She scanned the darkness, half expecting the attacker to emerge from the shadows. The yard was empty. Approaching the gate post cautiously, she saw the envelope was plain, unmarked. The primal fear urged her to leave it untouched, to summon the authorities, but the desperate need to know was stronger. Carefully, she pulled the envelope from the nail, the paper tearing slightly. Inside the opened envelope was a single sheet of paper covered in crude, handwritten block letters. The handwriting was erratic, aggressive. The message was short, but the impact was devastating.
Stop searching. They are dead anyway. Leave the past buried, or more will follow.
Quilla stared at the words, the breath leaving her body in a ragged gasp. It was a direct threat, a chilling confirmation that the attack on Zilla was indeed connected to the discovery of the buggy. The perpetrator knew who she was. He was watching her, reacting to her involvement. A chilling certainty settled over her. The man who attacked Zilla was the same man who took her daughters. The evil had a shape now, a voice, a smell. She took the letter to Russo the next morning. He examined it carefully, his expression darkening with each word. "He's escalating," Russo said. "The discovery of the buggy spooked him. He's trying to regain control." "He says they are dead," Quilla whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It might be an intimidation tactic," Russo cautioned. "A way to make you stop looking. We can't assume it's true." The letter was taken for analysis, fingerprints, DNA, paper analysis, but Quilla knew they would find nothing. The perpetrator had been careful, hiding his tracks for 9 years. The threat galvanized Quilla. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard anger. This man could not be allowed to terrorize her community. He could not dictate the fate of her daughters. The police investigation was moving too slowly, constrained by procedures and the maddening lack of concrete evidence. Quilla realized passivity was no longer an option. She had to find answers herself. She had to understand what happened 9 years ago. And she had to start at the beginning. The threat letter changed everything. It transformed the abstract fear into a tangible danger, but it also ignited a proactive drive in Quilla. Waiting for the police to find a needle in a haystack was unacceptable. If the attacker was watching her, motivated by her search, then she needed to understand the terrain he operated on, both literally and figuratively. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Quilla entered the barn. The familiar scent of hay and leather was a comforting embrace. She hitched her horse, a sturdy Morgan named Bess, to her own buggy. It was smaller than the delivery wagon, lighter, but the rhythmic movements of preparing the tack were the same. Her intention was to retrace the exact delivery route Iva and Elizabeth took on that fateful day in July 1995. It was a route she hadn't traveled in its entirety since the disappearance. The memory was too painful, the associations too raw. But now, it was necessary. Packing a small lunch and a jug of water, she left a note for the neighbors who were helping with the farm chores, simply stating she would be gone for the day. No one was told where she was going. The elders would disapprove, and the fear in the community was so palpable that any unusual activity would draw unwanted attention. This was a task she had to undertake alone. The buggy wheels crunched on the gravel lane as she left the farm. The morning air was cool, the valley still shrouded in mist. Quilla guided Bess onto the main settlement road. The clip-clop of the horse's hooves was the only sound in the stillness. The delivery route was extensive, winding through the settlement and extending to the neighboring English farms and small towns that relied on the Amish for produce and handcrafted goods. Iva and Elizabeth had been making these deliveries for years. They were experienced, capable. The route was safe, or so they had believed. Methodically, Quilla followed the route, visualizing her daughters on the road ahead of her. The first stop was the Miller farm, a few miles down the road. Stopping the buggy at the gate, she looked at the familiar farmhouse.
The Millers were still there, older now, their children grown. She didn't go in, just sat there, trying to see what her daughters had seen, to feel what they had felt. She continued on, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The landscape shifted from the ordered fields of the settlement to the more rugged terrain of the surrounding area. The edge of the settlement was reached, the boundary marked by a simple wooden sign. The next stops were the English farms, visiting the locations, some still active, others abandoned. She spoke to the people who were there, the last confirmed sightings of Iva and Elizabeth. She stopped at the Henderson farm, a large ranch that bordered the foothills. Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman who had always been fond of the Vault sisters, met her at the porch. concern. "Quilla, what are you doing out here?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her expression etched with concern. The news of the recent attack had spread beyond the settlement. "I'm retracing their steps," Quilla said simply, her gaze steady. "I need to know if there was anything missed, anything unusual that day." Mrs. Henderson, the memory clouding her eyes. "I've told the police everything I know, Quilla. They stopped here around noon. They seemed happy, cheerful. They were talking about the upcoming barn raising. They left, heading toward the general store in town." "Did you see anyone else on the road?" Quilla pressed, her voice urgent. "Any unfamiliar vehicles, strangers?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "It was quiet, just a normal summer day. I watched them go. They waved." She paused, the memory painful. "It was the last time I saw them." Quilla thanked her and continued on. The route led toward the small town of Oak Haven, a few miles away. The general store was still there, under new ownership. The previous owner, Mr. Gable, had retired and moved away.
The new owner knew nothing about the disappearance. The trail went cold after the general store. Iva and Elizabeth had presumably started the return journey toward the settlement, taking the back road that skirted the edge of the foothills. This was the stretch of road where the abduction likely occurred. Quilla guided Bess onto the back road. It was isolated, narrow, bordered by dense woods on one side and the rising slopes of the foothills on the other. This was the territory that led toward the old mining country, the area where the buggy was found. She scrutinized the route, her eyes scanning the landscape for anything unusual, anything that might explain how a horse and buggy and two young women could disappear without a trace in the middle of the afternoon. The road was deserted. The silence was heavy. Stopping the buggy several times, Quilla got out to examine the surroundings. She looked for signs of a struggle, remnants of the past. But 9 years of weather and neglect had erased any evidence. It was late afternoon when she noticed it, a subtle break in the dense foliage on the side of the road bordering the foothills, easily missed if you weren't actively looking for it. Stopping the buggy, she got out and pushed through the overgrown brush, the branches scratching at her arms. Behind the screen of foliage was a barely visible track, an old service road likely used for logging or mining access decades ago. It was overgrown, rutted, but still passable for a vehicle with high clearance. Quilla followed the track for a short distance. It led directly into the foothills, toward the mining territory. This was a potential abduction point. It offered isolation, a place where an attacker could lie in wait, hidden from the main road, and it provided a direct route to the mines, a way to transport the victims and the buggy away from the populated areas without being seen. It was the first tangible piece of the puzzle that fit. It explained the logistics of the disappearance, the absence of witnesses. Returning to the buggy, Quilla's mind raced. The discovery of the service road didn't tell her who the attacker was, but it told her how he operated. He was organized, calculated. He knew the terrain. He had planned the abduction. And if he knew the terrain that well, he was likely local, someone who knew the back roads, the abandoned mines, someone who blended in yet harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Amish. The clues were starting to align. The smell of yeast, the anti-Amish sentiment, the knowledge of the local geography. Quilla realized she needed to look closer at the outsiders who interacted with the community, the people who lived on the fringes, both geographically and culturally. Quilla's discovery of the overgrown service road solidified her hypothesis. The perpetrator was someone familiar with the remote geography of the foothills. Coupled with Zilla Hostetler's testimony, the pungent smell of yeast, and the venomous anti-Amish rhetoric, a specific profile began to emerge. This wasn't a random stranger passing through. This was someone rooted in the area, perhaps ex-Amish themselves and likely involved in an industry related to brewing or fermentation. The realization forced Quilla to confront a difficult path. The answers were not within the safe confines of the settlement. They were outside, in the English world she had always kept at arm's length. The next day, The journey to Oak Haven, the nearest non-Amish town, began. Guiding her buggy onto the asphalt streets, Quilla felt conspicuous and vulnerable. The noise was jarring. The rumble of engines, the blare of horns, the loud conversations of people rushing past. The modern world felt chaotic, aggressive. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands tight on the reins, a silent prayer forming on her lips. Tying Bess to a hitching post near the center of town, a relic of the past that seemed out of place amidst the modern storefronts, she noted the curious glances her Amish attire drew. She ignored them, focusing on her purpose. Her first stop was the general store, the same one Iva and Elizabeth had visited on the day they vanished. Although the ownership had changed, it remained a central hub for the local community, a place where gossip and information were exchanged freely. Entering the store, the bell above the door jingles cheerfully. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and spices.
She approached the counter, waiting patiently as the clerk, a young woman with bright pink hair, finished ringing up a customer. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, her tone friendly but distracted. "I'm looking for information," Quilla began, her voice quiet but firm. "About people who lived in this area around 1995. The clerk looked skeptical. "That's a long time ago. We don't really keep... I'm interested in anyone known to be hostile toward the Amish community," Quilla continued, pressing on. "Or anyone who might have been ex-Amish." The clerk's expression shifted. The mention of the Amish community, in light of the recent news, clearly caught her attention. "You're Mrs. Vout, aren't you?" Quilla nodded. "I'm sorry about your daughters and about what happened to Zilla Hostetler. It's terrible." She paused, thoughtful. "Hostile toward the Amish, that's specific. I don't know anyone like that now, but maybe some of the old-timers." She directed Quilla to the feed market on the edge of town, a place frequented by the local farmers and ranchers who had been in the area for decades. Quilla traveled to the feed market, a large, dusty warehouse filled with sacks of grain and farming equipment. The smell of hay and molasses was familiar, comforting. She found the owner, an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, in the back office. He was gruff, suspicious of outsiders, but Quilla's directness and her connection to the recent events persuaded him to talk. "Ex-Amish?" Mr. Abernathy scratched his chin, leaning back in his chair. "Not many of those around here. The settlement keeps to themselves, but hostile. Yeah, there was one guy." He paused, searching his memory. "Used to come in here regularly back in the mid-90s. Volatile fellow, always complaining. Had a chip on his shoulder the size of a redwood." "What was he complaining about?" Quilla asked, her heart pounding with a sudden urgency. "The Amish," Mr. Abernathy said emphatically. "Hated them. Said they were hypocrites, frauds. Said he had left a community in another state. Good riddance, I say. He was a nasty piece of work." A surge of adrenaline rushed through Quilla. This matched the profile with chilling accuracy. "What did he do for a living?" "He was trying to start a brewery," Mr. Abernathy said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A small operation out in the industrial area near the foothills. Thought he was going to make a fortune. Failed miserably. Went bankrupt a year or two later." A brewery. The smell of yeast, the proximity to the foothills, the timeline matched. "Do you remember his name?" Quilla asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "It was a long time ago. Started with a B, maybe Baxter, Byrne, something like that. I don't remember, but I remember the smell." "The smell?" "Yeah. He always smelled strongly of yeast, like he bathed in the stuff. Unpleasant." A chill ran through Quilla despite the dusty heat of the warehouse. The clues were converging. A bitter, ex-Amish man running a failed brewery near the foothills who smelled strongly of yeast. It was too specific to be a coincidence. Thanking Mr. Abernathy, she returned to her buggy. The name was still missing, but she had a concrete lead, a direction to focus her search. Identifying the failed brewery was the next step, and to do that she needed access to public records. The realization brought a new wave of apprehension.
The county records office was in the county seat, a larger town further away, even more chaotic and unfamiliar than Oakhaven. Navigating the bureaucracy of the English world was a daunting prospect, but Quilla knew she had no choice. The path forward led directly into the heart of the system she had always avoided. The lead from the feed market was the most significant breakthrough since the discovery of the buggy. The failed brewery connected the sensory details provided by Zilla with the geographical location of the disappearance and the psychological profile of the perpetrator. Now, a name was needed. The journey to the county seat was a trial in itself. The distance was too great for the buggy. Quilla had to hire a driver, a local man who often provided transport for the Amish community when travel to the English world was unavoidable. The experience was deeply uncomfortable. The speed of the car, the confinement of the cabin, the noise of the traffic, it all grated on her nerves. They arrived at the county records office, an imposing stone building in the center of the bustling town. Stepping out of the car, Quilla felt small and insignificant amidst the towering buildings and the crush of people. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for the task ahead. Inside the office was a maze of corridors and counters. The air was stale, smelling of dust and old paper. The noise was overwhelming. The ringing of phones, the clicking of keyboards, the murmur of conversations. It was a world away from the quiet stillness of the settlement.
The clerk told her it would take some time to retrieve the records from the archives. Quilla waited, sitting on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. The hours ticked by. The office bustled around her, but she remained still, a silent observer of a world she didn't belong to. Late in the afternoon, the clerk returned with a stack of dusty folders. These are the records for breweries active in the county between 1994 and 1996. You can look through them at the table over there. Quilla took the folders, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. Sitting at the table, she began to sift through the records. Most of them were for larger operations located in different parts of the county. Her focus remained on the permits for the industrial area near the foothills. She found it in the third folder, a business license application filed in 1994 for a small brewery called Bitter Creek Brewing. The location matched the industrial area described by Mr. Abernathy. The records indicated the business went bankrupt in 1996, and the owner's name was listed at the bottom of the application, Kenton Burr. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. Burr, the name Mr. Abernathy had suggested. Quilla stared at the name, the letters blurring slightly. Kenton Burr. The bitter ex-Amish man, the failed brewer, the man who smelled of yeast. She had a name. The abstract evil now had an identity. Her hand trembling slightly, she carefully copied the information onto a piece of paper. The address of the brewery was listed, as well as Burr's home address at the time of the application. She returned the folders to the clerk, thanking her politely. Leaving the records office, the noise and chaos faded behind her as she stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The journey back to Oakhaven was a blur. Quilla's mind was racing, the implications of the discovery overwhelming. Confirmation was needed. She needed to be sure. Thoughtful, she went directly to the feed market. Mr. Abernathy was closing up for the day. Urgent! Mr. Abernathy! Quilla called out, her voice urgent, cutting through the twilight. The name? Was it Kenton Burr? Mr. Abernathy paused, a sack of grain slung over his shoulder. He looked at her, his expression surprised. Surprised? Burr? Yeah, that was it, Kenton Burr. How did you find that? The records, Quilla said. The brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing, confirming. That's the one, Mr. Abernathy confirmed. Nasty fellow. Haven't seen him in years. Heard he moved north after the bankruptcy. The confirmation hit Quilla with the force of a physical blow. It was him. The connection was undeniable. Returning to the settlement as darkness gathered, she held the name close. Now she needed to convince Detective Russo. She needed to make him see the connection, the urgency, the realization that the man who took her daughters was still out there. Possibly living just a few hours away, brought a new wave of fear, but also a desperate, agonizing hope.
If he was alive, perhaps Iva and Elizabeth were too. Quilla met Detective Russo the next morning at the edge of the settlement, reluctant to bring him on to the settlement lands and further alienate the elders. They stood by the wooden sign marking the boundary, the morning mist swirling around them. She presented her findings, the information meticulously copied from the county records, the name Kenton Burr, the brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing, the timeline, 1994 to 1996.
The confirmation from Mr. Abernathy, the bitter ex-Amish man who smelled of yeast. Russo listened intently, his expression serious as he examined the paper, the details laid out starkly. "This is compelling, Mrs. Vout," he admitted, impressed by her tenacity. "The connection between the brewery, the smell, and the anti-Amish sentiment." Long pause. "It's a strong lead." Determined.
"He is the man who attacked Zilla," Quilla stated, her voice unwavering. "And he is the man who took my daughters."
Cautious. "We need to verify everything," Russo cautioned, though his tone suggested he believed her. "I'll run a background check on Kenton Burr, see where he is now." He left, taking the information with him. Returning to the farm, Quilla found the waiting agonizing. The hours stretched endlessly. Russo drove back to the station, his mind working through the implications. The Vout case had been cold for 9 years, a frustrating dead end. Now, thanks to the persistence of the victim's mother, they had a suspect, a strong one. He sat at his desk, the organized chaos of the major crimes unit swirling around him, and ran a background check on Kenton Burr. The results came quickly. Burr was still living in California, about 3 hours north in a small town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. His record was peppered with minor offenses, DUIs, disorderly conduct, a few assaults, nothing that screamed serial killer, but enough to suggest a volatile personality, a man with anger issues and a problem with authority. The profile fit the description of the man who attacked Zilla Hostetler, the aggression, the impulsivity. Russo dug deeper. The background check provided a timeline of Burr's life, his movements across the country. The focus turned to the period before Burr came to California, the time when he left the Amish community. Mr. Abernathy had mentioned Burr left a community in another state. Russo traced Burr's movements back to Pennsylvania, the heart of Amish country. Accessing the National Database for Unsolved Crimes, he searched for incidents involving the Amish community in the area where Burr had lived. He found it almost immediately. A cold case from 1992, the disappearance of a young Amish girl, Sarah Stoltz, aged 16. She had vanished while walking home from school. No witnesses, no evidence left behind. The case had never been solved. Russo felt a chill. The similarities to the Vout case were striking. The victim profile, the circumstances of the disappearance, the lack of evidence. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Police, requesting the case file for the Sarah Stoltz disappearance. The file was faxed over, the pages curled and faded. Sifting through the reports, the interviews, the theories, he saw the name Kenton Burr. Burr had been questioned at the time of the disappearance. He had recently left the Amish community, his departure acrimonious and public. He was known for his hostility toward the community, his open resentment of their lifestyle. But there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance. He had an alibi, albeit a weak one, and was dismissed as a suspect. Russo leaned back in his chair, the realization hitting him with full force. They were not dealing with an isolated incident. They were dealing with a serial offender, a man who had been hunting Amish women for over a decade. The Vout sisters were not his first victims, and the attack on Zilla Hostetler suggested they would not be his last. The urgency of the situation escalated dramatically. Burr was active, dangerous, and likely aware that the investigation was closing in on him. Russo initiated surveillance on Burr's current residence. He needed to know Burr's routine, his movements, his contacts. Evidence linking him directly to the Vout case was required, something concrete enough for a search warrant. The surveillance team was dispatched to Northern California. Russo waited impatiently for the first reports, the tension mounting. The Vout case had become a ticking clock, and he feared they were running out of time. The surveillance operation began immediately. A team of undercover officers established a perimeter around Kenton Burr's residence, a run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of the small Northern California town. The goal was to observe, document, and gather enough evidence to justify a warrant. Russo received the initial reports later that day. Bear was observed behaving erratically. He paced his apartment, peered through the blinds, and made frequent trips to his vehicle, a dark blue Ford Bronco, matching the description of the utility vehicle used in the attack on Zilla. He seemed paranoid, agitated. This was both encouraging and alarming. It suggested Burr was feeling the pressure, perhaps aware that the discovery of the buggy had reignited the investigation, but it also increased the risk that he might bolt, destroy evidence, or worse. Russo decided to oversee the surveillance operation personally. Driving north, he arrived late in the evening and met with the surveillance team, reviewing the logs and the photographs. The next day, Russo took up a position in an unmarked car, watching Burr's apartment. The hours dragged on, the monotony of surveillance punctuated by brief bursts of activity. Bear emerged mid-morning, looking disheveled and agitated. He got into his Bronco and drove out of the apartment complex. Russo and his team followed, maintaining a discreet distance. Bear drove aimlessly for a while, taking back roads, seemingly trying to detect if he was being followed. Finally, he headed toward an isolated industrial area outside of town. Russo recognized the area. It was the site of Bear's former brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing. The property was seemingly abandoned, surrounded by overgrown weeds and a rusted chain-link fence. The main building, a large warehouse, looked dilapidated, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling. Bear parked his Bronco near the entrance and got out. He looked around nervously before unlocking the gate and entering the property, disappearing inside the warehouse. Russo watched from a distance, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. Why would Bear be visiting an abandoned brewery, a place associated with his failure and bankruptcy? Bear remained inside the warehouse for several hours. Emerging late in the afternoon, he locked the gate behind him and drove back to his apartment. The pattern repeated the next day, and the day after that. Bear made repeated, lengthy visits to the abandoned warehouse. He was seen entering a specific section of the building, a large storage area that should have been condemned. Russo felt a growing certainty that the warehouse was significant, isolated, secure, and directly linked to Bear's past. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. Russo reported back to Quilla, the frustration evident in his voice. He met her at the edge of the settlement, the tension between them palpable.
He's spending hours at the old brewery, Russo explained, leaning against his car, the frustration clear in his voice. The warehouse. We think he's using it for something. Then search it, Quilla urged, her voice tight with impatience, a desperate plea. If he is the man who took my daughters, the answers are in there. We can't, Russo said, rubbing his temples, the weariness evident. We don't have enough probable cause for a search warrant. The connection to the Vout case is still circumstantial. We have the background match, the suspicious activity, but no direct evidence linking him to the disappearance or the attack on Zilla. The smell, Quilla insisted, her voice rising. The brewery, the ex-Amish background, it all fits. It fits a profile, Russo countered. But it's not enough for a judge. If we go in without a warrant, any evidence we find will be inadmissible. We have to do this by the book. Quilla was distraught at the delay. The legal constraints of the English world felt like a cruel joke. While the police waited for permission, the man who terrorized her community was free, active. The recent attack on Zilla convinced her that Burr was escalating. She feared he might disappear, taking the truth with him. And the agonizing possibility remained, faint but persistent, that one of her daughters might still be alive, held captive in that warehouse. The image of the dark, dilapidated building haunted her. The thought of Iva or Elizabeth trapped inside, suffering for 9 years while the world moved on, was unbearable. The police were paralyzed, constrained by rules and procedures. Quilla realized with a chilling clarity that if she wanted answers, she would have to find them herself. The realization was terrifying, but also liberating. Relying on the English authorities was no longer an option. The fight was hers now. The understanding that the investigation was stalling, hampered by the very laws meant to protect, crystallized a desperate resolve within Quilla. The police were too constrained, their movements too predictable. If they couldn't act, she would. She had to see Kenton Burr for herself, to see the brewery. Proof was needed, something undeniable that would force Rousseau's hand.
The decision was a profound transgression against the norms of her community, against the teachings of her faith. To actively pursue the man who had wronged her, to immerse herself in the darkness of his world. It was contrary to the principles of acceptance and non-resistance. But the primal drive of a mother seeking her children overshadowed everything else. The logistics were complex. Traveling to Northern California, a journey of several hours, required secrecy. She approached the driver she had hired before, a man named Elias, known for his discretion. "I need you to take me north," she told him, her voice low and urgent. "A few hours away. I will be gone for a few days." Elias looked at her, his expression troubled. He knew the context, the recent events. "Quilla, this is dangerous. The elders—" "I will not ask you to lie for me," Quilla interrupted, her gaze resolute. "But I must go. Will you take me?" Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I will take you." Quilla packed a small bag, her movements methodical, detached. She wore her traditional Amish attire, the dark dress, the white bonnet. It would make her conspicuous, but it was also a shield, a reminder of who she was and why she was doing this. A message was left with her neighbors, a half-truth, stating she was traveling to visit distant relatives who needed assistance. It was a plausible excuse, but she knew it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. The only thing that mattered was finding the truth.
The journey north was a blur of asphalt and noise. Quilla sat in the passenger seat, silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The familiar farmland of her home gave way, replaced by the relentless, sprawling hills of the Sierra Nevada foothills, a landscape both beautiful and unforgiving. They arrived in the small town late in the afternoon. Elias dropped her off at a modest motel on the edge of town, a place designed for anonymity, catering to travelers merely passing through. The transaction was awkward, the motel clerk's gaze lingering on Quilla with an undisguised curiosity. Settling into the small, sterile room, Quilla's senses were assaulted by the unpleasant smell of disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke. The muffled sound of a television seeped through the thin walls from the neighboring room. She felt utterly alone, isolated in this alien world. She had the address of Bear's apartment complex provided by Rousseau during their last tense meeting. It was a few miles away, on the other side of town. As evening fell, casting long shadows, Quilla left the motel. She walked, the distance manageable, the rhythmic movement of her steps a small comfort against the rising tide of her nerves. Approaching the apartment complex cautiously, she saw it was a tired collection of two-story buildings, paint peeling, landscaping neglected, a monument to faded hopes. Bear's apartment was on the ground floor, its blinds drawn tight, like eyes refusing to meet the world. Locating a spot across the street, a small park bench swallowed by the deep shadows of a gnarled oak tree, she sat down, a silent sentinel. Staking out Bear was a perilous endeavor. Her distinct Amish attire made blending in impossible. She had to rely on the deepening darkness and the desperate hope that no one would pay attention to a woman sitting quietly, almost invisibly, on a park bench. The hours ticked by, each second a slow drop in an endless well. The night was quiet,
the stillness punctuated only by the occasional distant hum of a passing car or the mournful bark of a faraway dog. Around midnight, the lights in Bear's apartment flickered and died. Quilla remained, a statue carved from anxiety, watching, waiting. The next morning, she returned to the park bench before sunrise, watching as the apartment complex slowly stirred to life. People emerged, heading to work, their routines mundane, ordinary, oblivious. Bear emerged around 8 a.m. Quilla saw him clearly for the first time, her breath catching in her throat. He was a large man, heavy-set, his movements aggressive even in the simple act of walking to his car. He wore stained jeans and a dark t-shirt. His hair was unkempt, his face unshaven, a landscape of neglect. He matched the description provided by Zilla perfectly. The hulking build, the unsettling aggression. He got into his vehicle, the dark blue Bronco, and Quilla watched him drive away, the rumble of the engine fading into the distance. Following him on foot was impossible here. He drove to a local diner, a greasy spoon frequented by truckers and locals, and went inside. Quilla waited outside, observing him through the large, grimy windows. He sat alone in a booth, hunched over a cup of coffee, his restless energy palpable. The day was spent observing his routine. He returned to his apartment, then left again in the afternoon, driving toward the industrial area. The distance was too great, the area too isolated for Quilla to follow in there on foot. She returned to the motel in the evening, exhausted but galvanized by a fierce, renewed purpose. She had seen him. His identity was confirmed, and she had witnessed his strange, obsessive visits to the abandoned brewery. The warehouse was the key. She knew it with a chilling certainty. The answers were inside, and she had to find a way to get in. Quilla shifted her entire focus from Burr's apartment to the abandoned brewery. Her discreet surveillance had confirmed that he spent most of his days there, hidden away in the dilapidated warehouse. The desperate need to see inside, to understand what he was hiding, became an all-consuming obsession. She decided to scout the property at night. The risk was immense, a terrifying leap into the unknown, but the cloak of darkness offered a cover she desperately needed. A taxi took her to the edge of the industrial area, and she asked the driver to drop her off a mile from the brewery. The rest of the way had to be on foot, the profound silence of the deserted streets amplifying the frantic pounding of her heart. The brewery was located at the end of a narrow access road, surrounded by other abandoned warehouses and empty lots, their hollow shells echoing the desolation. The isolation was profound, absolute. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and decay, a grim perfume. Quilla approached the property cautiously, her senses on high alert. A rusted chain-link fence topped with menacing barbed wire surrounded the perimeter. The main gate was secured with a heavy, unyielding padlock. The property was overgrown with weeds, a wild, tangled neglect. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, betraying years of disuse. The warehouse itself was a large, imposing structure. Its windows were either crudely boarded up or shattered, gaping holes in its rusted, stained metal siding. It looked derelict, utterly abandoned, a ghost of industry. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird as she approached the fence. She needed to find a way in. The fence was high, the barbed wire a menacing glint in the faint moonlight. She circled the property slowly, quietly, a shadow in the shadows. Eventually, she found a section of the fence where the ground had eroded, creating a small gap underneath. It was tight, barely passable. Hesitation gripped her, a cold tendril of fear. The primal instinct urged her to turn back. This was illegal, dangerous. If Bear found her here, there would be no one to help her, no one to hear her cries. But the thought of her daughters, the agonizing possibility that they might be inside, propelled her forward with an almost supernatural strength. Quilla knelt down, ignoring the dirt and grime as she squeezed under the fence. The jagged metal scraped brutally against her back. When she emerged on the other side, her breath was held tight in her chest, a silent prayer. She was inside the perimeter. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against a faint glow of distant city lights. She kept low, using the overgrown weeds and discarded equipment as cover, a phantom moving through the desolate yard. As she drew closer, subtle signs emerged, betraying that the brewery was not entirely abandoned. A specific section of the warehouse, the very area where Russo's surveillance had observed Burr entering, seemed to hum with a faint life. A weak yellow light seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows like whispers of warmth from within a tomb. And the smell. It was stronger here, overwhelmingly so. The pungent odor of yeast and fermentation, the sickly sweet scent of stale beer. But something else was mixed with it, something foul, profoundly unpleasant. The unmistakable smell of decay. Quilla suppressed a wave of nausea, the sickening scent triggering a visceral, primal reaction. She pressed her ear against the cold, corrugated metal of the warehouse wall. Muffled sounds came from inside, the low, rhythmic hum of machinery running, a faint scraping, and something else. Indistinct, unrecognizable, a sound that twisted her stomach into knots. She needed to see inside. The wall offered few options for viewing. She searched until she found a window that wasn't boarded up, but it was caked in grime, the glass opaque like cataract-blinded eye. Her frantic attempts to wipe the grime away with her sleeve proved useless. It was thick, stubborn, a barrier of years. The interior was barely discernible through the murk. A large, cluttered space, shapes indistinct in the dim, ghostly light. She needed to get closer. The main entrance was a massive roll-up door secured with another heavy, unforgiving padlock. She moved toward it, her heart thudding. Suddenly a low, guttural growl broke the suffocating silence. Quilla froze, every muscle tensed, her breath caught in her throat. She scanned the darkness, her eyes wide. A large, menacing shape emerged from the deeper shadows near the entrance. A dog. A Rottweiler, massive and aggressive, its powerful body radiating menace. It was chained to a metal stake driven into the ground, but the lead was long, allowing it a wide, dangerous range of movement. The dog saw her. It barked viciously, a deafening explosion of sound that ripped through the stillness of the night. It lunged toward her, the chain snapping taut with a violent clang as it reached the end of its tether. The dog was agitated, a picture of pure ferocity, straining against its confines, teeth bared, eyes fixed on her with predatory intent. Quilla stumbled back, a jolt of pure adrenaline surging through her veins. She hadn't expected a guard dog. The noise was too loud. If Burr was inside, he would have heard it. Retreat was the only option. She turned and ran back toward the fence, the dog's relentless barking echoing behind her, a terrifying soundtrack to her escape. She scrambled under the fence, the metal scraping her skin again, and disappeared into the deeper darkness. She didn't stop running until she reached the main road, her lungs burning, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had failed to get inside the warehouse, but her suspicions were chillingly confirmed. Burr was using the brewery. He was hiding something there, and he was protecting it fiercely. The setback was frustrating, a bitter taste in her mouth, but it also clarified the challenge. Getting into the brewery undetected was impossible. The security measures were too tight, too professional. A new strategy was needed. She needed to rattle Burr, force him to make a mistake, to expose himself. Direct confrontation was the only path left. The decision was terrifying, reckless, a desperate gamble. But Quilla knew, with a cold, hard certainty, that it was the only way. The passive observation had reached its limit. It was time for action. The encounter with the guard dog crystallized the grim reality of the situation. The brewery was a fortress, and Kenton Burr was guarding its secrets fiercely. Quilla realized that a stealthy approach was impossible. The police were still immobilized by legal constraints, trapped in their bureaucratic labyrinth. Time was running out. A highly risky strategy was formulated. She couldn't get into the brewery, but she could get to Burr. The objective was stark: to unnerve him, to drag him from the shrouds of shadow into the unforgiving glare of light. Publicly confirming his identity, exposing him, might just force a critical error from his panicked mind. Through relentless surveillance, Quilla had meticulously charted Burr's routine. Every morning, precisely at 8 o'clock, he frequented the local diner, a greasy spoon perched on the town's edge. It was a public space, neutral ground, offering a fragile veneer of protection, yet also harboring the volatile potential for confrontation. The following morning, Quilla arrived at the diner long before the first hint of sunrise. She settled into a booth near the entrance, her back strategically against the wall, affording her an unobstructed view of the entire room. She ordered a black coffee, the bitter liquid scalding her throat. The diner was hushed, its early morning clientele sparse. A few weary truckers, a pair of locals silently absorbed in their newspapers. The waitress, though eyeing her with a flicker of curiosity, asked no questions. Quilla waited, her hands clasped tightly around the warm mug. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. The words she would unleash, the questions she would pose, were meticulously rehearsed in the silent theater of her mind. Precisely at 8 o'clock, the bell above the door jingled, announcing Kenton Burr's arrival. He moved with the same aggressive, almost predatory energy she had observed before. He appeared disheveled, agitated. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room before settling into his usual booth in the back corner. Quilla watched him, her gaze unwavering. The waitress approached him, their interaction brief, familiar. Burr ordered his coffee. Thoughtful the Burrs, this was it. Rising, Quilla's movements were deliberate, measured. As she walked toward Burr's booth, the eyes of the other patrons, previously disinterested, now tracked her every step. The diner's silence seemed to deepen, the tension palpable, thick enough to taste. She reached his booth. Burr looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and expectation. He didn't recognize her at first. He merely saw an Amish woman, seemingly out of place, perhaps seeking charity or assistance. "Kenton Burr," Quilla stated, her voice clear and steady, a blade cutting through the charged silence. Burr froze, the coffee mug halfway to his lips. His eyes widened in a flicker of surprise, then swiftly narrowed into suspicion. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Quilla Hochstetler." The recognition hit him instantly, a blow to the gut. He must have seen her picture in the local news coverage surrounding the buggy discovery, or perhaps he had been watching the settlement, studying his victims. "Shh, you," he hissed, the single word laced with venom. "I want to know what happened to my daughters," Quilla continued, her voice unwavering, a steady force against his rising anger. "I want to know about the abandoned mine shaft." Burr's expression darkened, a storm of pure rage gathering in his eyes. "You have no right to be here. You have no right to ask me anything." "And the smell of yeast?" Quilla pressed on, her words carefully calculated to provoke a raw reaction. "The smell on the day Zilla Hochstetler was attacked, the same smell that clings to you now." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The other patrons in the diner were openly staring now, their hushed conversations abruptly silenced. Burr's reaction was explosive. He slammed the coffee mug onto the table, the hot liquid sloshing violently over the rim. Standing up, he loomed over Quilla, a towering figure of incandescent fury. "You crazy bitch," he roared, his face contorted in rage. "You think you can come here and accuse me? You think you can dredge up the past?" He lunged forward, flipping the table with a violent heave. Dishes shattered on the floor, the cacophony echoing in the sudden, absolute silence that followed. Quilla stumbled back, the raw violence of his reaction shocking her, despite her prior anticipation. Bear was a creature unleashed, rage consuming him, his carefully constructed anonymity shattered. He lunged forward, hands clenched into lethal fists. "I should kill you right now," he snarled, his voice a guttural roar that echoed through the stunned diner, silencing every whisper. From the kitchen, the diner owner burst forth, alarm etched across his face. "Hey, what the hell is going on here? Get out! I'm calling the police!" The word police pierced Bear's fury, a sharp pinprick of cold reality. He paused, his gaze darting around the suddenly hostile room. He was exposed, vulnerable, a cornered beast in a public cage, his eyes, burning with pure hatred, locked on Tequila. "This isn't over. You hear me? This isn't over." With that promise of retribution, he stormed out, the door slamming shut with a violent shudder, the bell above it jingling a frantic, desperate protest. Quilla stood amidst the wreckage, scattered dishes, spilled coffee, her body trembling, but her resolve had hardened into an unyielding steel. The initial goal was achieved. Bear was panicked, his carefully guarded identity revealed. His volatile outburst, his desperate threats, confirmed his undeniable connection to the events that had shattered her life. Yet in doing so, she had plunged herself into immediate, critical danger. Bear knew she was here. He knew she was hunting him, and he had just vowed to end her life in front of witnesses. As she swiftly exited the diner, the gazes of the lingering patrons followed her, a mixture of fear and judgment in their eyes. She stepped out into the harsh, bright morning sunlight and didn't look back. The confrontation, she knew, was far from over. The chase had just begun. Quilla burst through the diner doors, the sudden sunlight momentarily blinding her. She didn't dare look back, an instinct screaming that Bear was right behind her. The guttural roar of his rage echoed, swiftly followed by the shriek of the diner door slamming open once more. Running blindly, fueled by a raw surge of adrenaline, the quiet morning streets of the small town transformed instantly into a terrifying labyrinth. Bear stormed out moments after her, his pursuit immediate and relentless. He was faster than she anticipated, his long strides devouring the distance between them with terrifying speed. "You can't run!" he bellowed, his voice tearing through the deserted streets. "You ruined everything!" Quilla was at a severe disadvantage. No vehicle, no intimate knowledge of these unfamiliar streets, no cell phone. Her distinctive Amish attire made her conspicuously visible, an impossible target to miss against the muted backdrop of the town. She ducked sharply into a narrow alleyway, the sudden cool darkness offering a momentary, desperate reprieve. Pressing herself against the cold, rough brick wall, her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Burr skidded to a halt at the alley's entrance, his eyes furiously scanning the inky shadows. He hesitated, a crucial moment of uncertainty. Had she vanished deeper into the gloom or found another escape? Quilla seized the precious opportunity. Scrambling with desperate urgency over a low wooden fence at the alley's far end, she emerged into a small, neglected courtyard. She sprinted across it, through an open gate, and burst onto another street. Blending in, disappearing into the burgeoning morning crowd was now paramount. Ahead, a bustling outdoor market materialized, its stalls already thronged with shoppers. She surged towards it, the chilling echo of Burr's footsteps steadily closing behind her. Plunging into the vibrant chaos of the market, she weaved desperately through the narrow aisles, the kaleidoscope of colors, the cacophony of vendors' cries, and the crush of bodies swirling around her. The blessed anonymity of the crowd offered a fragile, fleeting shield. Burr crashed into the market moments later, his aggressive, frantic movements disrupting the natural flow of shoppers. He scanned the crowd, his eyes wild with a desperate, animalistic rage. Quilla kept moving, staying low, using the towering stalls and the unwitting shoppers as her desperate cover. She saw his head snap in her direction, his furious gaze sweeping dangerously close. Ducking behind a sprawling display of fruits and vegetables, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He moved closer, his presence a suffocating weight. The nauseating, familiar odor of yeast and sweat mingled with the earthy fragrance of the market cut through the air. He was just a few feet away. Holding her breath, she prayed, a silent, desperate plea that he wouldn't see her. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the far end of the market. A fruit stall had collapsed, sending a cascade of bright oranges rolling across the cobblestones, scattering like an explosion of color. Burr's head snapped toward the sound, his attention momentarily diverted. Quilla didn't hesitate. Slipping away from her hiding spot, she melted back into the moving river of the crowd, accelerating towards the market's exit. Quilla was at a severe disadvantage. No vehicle, no intimate knowledge of these unfamiliar streets, no cell phone. Her distinctive Amish attire made her conspicuously visible, an impossible target to miss against the muted backdrop of the town. She ducked sharply into a narrow alleyway, the sudden, cool darkness offering a momentary, desperate reprieve. Pressing herself against the cold, rough brick wall, her breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Burr skidded to a halt at the alley's entrance, his eyes furiously scanning the inky shadows. He hesitated, a crucial moment of uncertainty. Had she vanished deeper into the gloom or found another escape? Quilla seized the precious opportunity. Scrambling with desperate urgency over a low wooden fence at the alley's far end, she emerged into a small, neglected courtyard. She sprinted across it through an open gate and burst onto another street. Blending in, disappearing into the burgeoning morning crowd was now paramount. Ahead, a bustling outdoor market materialized, its stalls already thronged with shoppers. She surged towards it, the chilling echo of Burr's footsteps steadily closing behind her. Plunging into the vibrant chaos of the market, she weaved desperately through the narrow aisles, the kaleidoscope of colors, the cacophony of vendors' cries, and the crush of bodies swirling around her. The blessed anonymity of the crowd offered a fragile, fleeting shield. Burr crashed into the market moments later, his aggressive, frantic movements disrupting the natural flow of shoppers. He scanned the crowd, his eyes wild with a desperate, animalistic rage. Quilla kept moving, staying low, using the towering stalls and the unwitting shoppers as her desperate cover. She saw his head snap in her direction, his furious gaze sweeping dangerously close. Ducking behind a sprawling display of fruits and vegetables, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He moved closer, his presence a suffocating weight. The nauseating, familiar odor of yeast and sweat mingled with the earthy fragrance of the market cut through the air. He was just a few feet away. Holding her breath, she prayed, a silent, desperate plea that he wouldn't see her. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the far end of the market. A fruit stall had collapsed, sending a cascade of bright oranges rolling across the cobblestones, scattering like an explosion of color. Burr's head snapped toward the sound, his attention momentarily diverted. Quilla didn't hesitate. Slipping away from her hiding spot, she melted back into the moving river of the crowd, accelerating toward the market's exit. Emerging onto the street, the vibrant clamor of the market faded behind her. She looked back, fully expecting to see Burr bursting from the crowd in hot pursuit, but he was gone. She had lost him. For the moment. Getting away from this immediate area was crucial now. Finding a place to hide, to regroup, to plan her next desperate move. Across the street, a public transit bus rumbled into view, approaching its stop. She ran towards it, lungs burning, legs heavy with exhaustion, reaching the stop just as the doors hissed open. Scrambling onto the bus, she fumbled frantically for change in her pocket. As she moved towards the back, she saw him. Burr had burst from the market, his gaze instantly locking onto her. He sprinted towards the bus, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Oblivious to the unfolding drama, the bus driver closed the doors. Burr reached the bus just as it began to pull away. He banged furiously on the windows, his shouts muffled and distorted by the glass. Quilla watched him from the window, her body trembling with a mixture of raw relief and lingering terror. He stood in the street, a solitary, furious figure, watching the bus disappear down the road, his form shrinking until he vanished from sight. She was safe, for the moment. Getting off the bus in a different part of town, she found herself in a quiet residential area, far from the town center. The streets were lined with mature trees, the houses small and neatly kept. She spotted a public library, a modern, imposing building. Inside, the cool, quiet atmosphere offered a welcome respite from the recent chaos of the chase. In a secluded corner, she sank onto a chair, the silence enveloping her like a balm. She was safe, yes, but the victory was agonizingly temporary. Burr knew she was in the area. He was actively hunting her, and he was enraged, unpredictable, a predator pushed to its limits. The confrontation had forced him out into the open, but it had also backed him into a corner, and a cornered animal, she knew, was always the most dangerous. Quilla knew she had to act, and swiftly. The harrowing chase had paradoxically created a window of opportunity. Burr was utterly consumed, his focus narrowed solely on hunting her. He wouldn't be at the brewery. This was her chance, her only chance, to breach the warehouse. The adrenaline from the chase slowly receded, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Burr would be scouring the town for her, his rage blinding him to all else. He would be distracted, preoccupied. This was the precise window she had engineered, a brief, precious moment when the brewery would be unguarded. It could not be squandered. As evening fell, the encroaching darkness offered a degree of cover. Quilla slipped from the library. The quiet streets now felt ominous, menacing. She had to make her way back to the isolated industrial area, a journey of several miles without being detected. Back roads and alleys became her allies, their shadows concealing her movements. She moved slowly, cautiously, every sense heightened. Every passing car, every distant sound sent a jolt of fear through her. The guard dog remained a formidable problem. That ferocious Rottweiler was a massive obstacle, and another direct confrontation was simply too risky. She stopped at a small grocery store, the bright fluorescent lights jarring against the deepening twilight. She purchased a package of raw meat, the thick steaks feeling heavy and substantial in her hand. Her next stop was a pharmacy. The sterile environment smelled sharply of alcohol and medicine. She bought a bottle of a mild sedative, a sleep aid the pharmacist recommended. The plan was fraught with risk, uncertain, yet it was the only option she had left. Late in the evening, she reached the industrial area. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. Abandoned buildings loomed like skeletal remains against the bruised night sky. The brewery property lay just ahead. Quilla approached with extreme caution, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The chain-link fence was still there, a dark, jagged silhouette against the pale moonlight. At the familiar spot, she squeezed under the fence, the rough metal scraping painfully against her skin.
Once on the other side, the sickening smell of yeast and decay washed over her, thick and cloying. She kept low, moving stealthily toward the warehouse, her eyes diligently scanning the impenetrable darkness. The guard dog was there, chained near the main entrance, curled into a tight, sleeping ball. Quilla approached the dog slowly, her movements deliberate, almost imperceptible. In her hand, she held the raw meat, the sedative sprinkled generously over its surface. The dog stirred, lifting its massive head. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in its chest. Quilla froze. She held out the meat. "Shh," she whispered, her voice a soft, soothing murmur. "It's okay." The dog hesitated, suspicion warring with instinct, but the potent smell of the raw meat was overwhelmingly enticing. It stood, taking a tentative step toward her. She tossed the meat. It landed on the ground a few feet away. The dog looked from the meat to Quilla, then back to the meat. Hunger won. It lunged, devouring the steak in a few hungry gulps. Quilla waited, her breath held tight in her chest. The sedative would take time to work.
The dog remained alert for a few minutes, pacing restlessly, a dark, sinuous shadow. Then its movements began to slow, becoming sluggish, heavy. Finally, it lay down, its massive head resting on its paws, its eyes slowly closing. The dog was neutralized. Now she needed to find a way inside. The back of the warehouse seemed more promising than the main entrance, with its formidable roll-up door. A small, grimy window caught her attention. One corner of the glass was broken, and though high on the wall, it appeared accessible. She scanned the area for something to stand on. A discarded wooden pallet leaned against the wall. She dragged it toward the window, the harsh scraping sound echoing loudly in the profound silence. The pallet was unsteady beneath her feet as she carefully climbed onto it. She reached the window. The remaining glass had to be dealt with. Another desperate search yielded a rusted, discarded tire iron hidden in the weeds nearby. She used the tire iron to smash the window, the sound of shattering glass echoing violently in the stillness. Working quickly, she cleared the remaining shards from the frame, creating an opening just large enough to climb through. The rough metal frame dug into her hands as she pulled herself up, every muscle straining. She scrambled through the opening and dropped onto the concrete floor inside the warehouse. The landing was hard, jarring her entire body. She lay there for a moment, listening intently, her senses overwhelmed by the absolute darkness and the pervasive cloying smell. She was inside. The air was thick, heavy, almost viscous. The smell of stale beer and decay intensified, threatening to suffocate her. The darkness was absolute, a crushing void, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering hesitantly through the shattered window above. Quilla pushed herself to her feet. Slowly, painstakingly, her eyes began to adjust to the gloom. She was in a vast, cluttered space. The interior of the warehouse was a disorienting maze of shadows and indistinct, hulking shapes. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint, distant hum of unseen machinery and the rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep within. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, but her determination was stronger, a fierce, burning ember. She had come too far to turn back now. She began to move into the darkness, navigating the cluttered space with painstaking care, heading toward the area where the lights had been seen. The section where Burr spent his time, the place where the secrets were undoubtedly hidden. Quilla navigated the profound darkness of the warehouse, her movements slow and agonizingly cautious. The interior was a cavernous space, the unseen ceiling impossibly high above her, the shadows stretching long and grotesquely distorted in the weak, pale moonlight. The air remained thick and heavy, the cloying smell of yeast and decay so potent it coated her tongue with a bitter, metallic taste. But beneath it, that foul odor she had noticed before was now far more pronounced. A distinctly human smell of sweat, of filth, and something else, something sickeningly sweet and deeply unsettling. Moving through a disorienting maze of old brewing equipment, towering metal vats, rusted pipes, and precarious stacks of wooden pallets, she found the concrete floor slick with spilled liquids, her footing treacherous. The oppressive silence was punctuated by the low hum of refrigeration units, a chilling suggestion that parts of this desolate brewery were still operational. She pressed on, heading toward the area where she had observed the lights, the section of the warehouse Bear frequented. In the farthest, darkest corner, she found it. The makeshift living space, crudely carved out of the surrounding clutter. It was a profoundly disturbing sight. A filthy mattress lay directly on the floor, surrounded by a repulsive scatter of discarded food containers and empty beer bottles. A small, portable television flickered silently in a corner, its eerie, shifting glow casting grotesque shadows over the squalor. The walls were covered in strange writings and symbols, scrawled furiously in black marker. Quilla stared at them, her blood running cold. It was a twisted ideology, a horrifying jumble of religious condemnation, venomous, misogynistic rants, and bizarre ritualistic phrases. This was a chilling glimpse into the utter darkness of Bear's mind, his festering hatred and resentment laid bare for her to witness. A wave of nausea washed over Quilla, threatening to overwhelm her. This was the vile environment where Bear nurtured his hatred, where he plotted his revenge against a world he clearly believed had wronged him. Frantically, she began to search the squalid living space, desperate for any sign of her daughters, any piece of evidence linking Bear to their disappearance. Nothing. No scraps of clothing, no personal items, nothing to suggest that Iva or Elizabeth had ever set foot in this horrifying lair. The frustration mounted, sharp and painful. The warehouse was vast, the clutter overwhelming. If there was something here, it was expertly hidden. Expanding her desperate search, she moved deeper into the warehouse, venturing into areas that seemed completely abandoned, utterly unused. She found herself in a section that appeared to be a storage area, filled with towering stacks of old grain sacks and forgotten, discarded equipment. The air was noticeably colder here, the smell of decay even stronger, more pungent. It was then that she noticed it. Hidden behind an immense stack of grain sacks, almost invisible in the profound gloom, a heavy metal door. It looked like an old cold storage room, the kind once used for preserving perishable goods. But this door was reinforced, the metal thick and solid, and it was secured with a large, brand-new padlock, its polished metal gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. A cold storage room, reinforced and padlocked, in an abandoned brewery.
Quilla approached the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her initial suspicion solidifying into a chilling, absolute certainty. This was what Bear was hiding. Pressing her ear against the cold, unyielding metal, she listened intently. The silence was heavy, oppressive. At first, she heard nothing. Then a faint sound, a slight shifting movement, a suppressed breath. Someone was inside. Quilla's breath caught in her throat. A gasp stifled by the sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. Agonizing hope, desperate fear, they collided in a dizzying wave. Iva, Elizabeth. She had to get inside. The padlock was thick, solid metal. Breaking it with her bare hands was an impossible fantasy. Frantically, she began to search the immediate area, her eyes darting, desperate for tools, for anything that could help her. The suffocating darkness severely hampered her search, the overwhelming clutter obscuring everything, turning every shadow into a potential hiding place. Finally, under a grimy, splintered workbench, she discovered a toolbox. Its metal was rusted, deeply stained, and inside, a disorganized, dirty collection of tools lay jumbled together. Her desperate gaze landed on a heavy bolt cutter. Its blades were dull, its handles stiff with disuse, but it was her only hope. Returning to the reinforced door, the heavy bolt cutter felt like a lead weight in her trembling hands. She positioned the blades around the thick, gleaming shank of the new padlock, the cold metal biting into her skin. Squeezing the handles with every ounce of strength she possessed, she leaned into the effort. The metal groaned, protesting with a long, drawn-out shriek of resistance. The padlock held firm. She tried again, a fresh surge of adrenaline coursing through her, lending her renewed, desperate strength. She squeezed harder, the muscles in her arms screaming in protest, burning with exertion. Then, with a sudden deafening crack, the metal snapped. The sound reverberated through the profound silence of the warehouse, echoing like a gunshot. The padlock clattered to the ground, its clang painfully loud in the stillness. The door was unlocked. Quilla hesitated, her hand trembling violently as she reached for the handle. The fear of what she might find on the other side was an overwhelming, suffocating weight. The crushing possibility of disappointment, the horrifying confirmation of her worst fears. But the desperate need to know, to truly know, was stronger than any terror. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she steeled herself for whatever lay beyond. She turned the handle and pulled the heavy metal door open. A wave of icy, stale air washed over her, carrying with it an almost palpable stench of filth, decay, and utter despair. The darkness inside the room was absolute, a void. Stepping across the threshold, Quilla's eyes struggled
agonizingly to adjust to the oppressive gloom. The silence was heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of her own breathing, loud in her ears. "Iva," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, trembling with a fragile hope. "Elizabeth?" No response. Reaching blindly for a light switch on the concrete wall, her fingers fumbled until they found it. She flipped it on. A single bare bulb flickered to life with a buzzing hum, casting a dim, sickly yellowish light over the scene.
The sight that greeted her was so horrific, so profoundly wrong that Quilla felt the world tilt precariously beneath her feet. The room was small, windowless, a concrete cell. The conditions were unspeakable. The floor was covered in a thick layer of filth, the walls stained and peeling with damp and neglect. A thin, dirty mattress lay slumped in one corner, the only piece of furniture in the desolate space. The air was frigid, the overwhelming smell of human waste and utter despair truly suffocating. In the center of the room, huddled on the filthy floor, was a woman. She was pale, almost translucent with emaciation. Dressed in ragged, ill-fitting, non-Amish clothing, a stained t-shirt and sweatpants that hung loose on her skeletal frame, her hair was long, tangled and matted with dirt. She was rocking back and forth, slowly, rhythmically, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes closed, reciting something in a low, monotonous, droning voice. The strange, ritualistic phrases were instantly recognizable from the disturbing writings scrawled across the warehouse walls. Quilla stared at her, her heart tearing itself apart in her chest. The woman was broken, utterly traumatized, a lost soul adrift. And then, the woman opened her eyes. They were blue, a bright, piercing, unmistakable blue. The same vivid blue as Elizabeth's, the same haunting blue as Iva's. The recognition slammed into Quilla with the brutal force of a physical blow. It was Iva, her younger daughter, 19 when she vanished, now 28. "Iva," Quilla whispered, the name a ragged prayer, a desperate plea torn from her soul. Iva looked at her, her eyes wide with a profound animalistic fear, yet utterly devoid of recognition. Scrambling backward, she pressed herself violently against the cold concrete wall, her emaciated body trembling uncontrollably. "No," she whispered, her voice a reedy, broken sound. "He would be angry. I am not allowed to speak." She was terrified of Quilla, terrified of some unknown punishment from Burr. The 9 years of captivity had erased her identity, her very memory, severing her connection to the world she had once known.
Quilla approached her slowly, her movements gentle, soothing. Nailing down, her hands were outstretched. "Iva, it's me. It's Mama." Iva shook her head, the movement frantic, desperate. "Number I am anathema. I am nothing." The words were a twisted berserk lullaby of the ideology he had forced upon her. Fighting back the tears, Quilla felt the grief overwhelm her. Her daughter had been found, but she was lost. She had to reach her, to break through the wall of trauma and indoctrination. She began speaking to Iva in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of their community, the language of their home. The words felt strange, foreign in this horrific place, but they were the only connection she had to the past. "Iva, my sweet girl, do you remember the farm, the horses, Bess?" Iva hesitated, her rocking slowing down. The familiar sounds of the language seemed to penetrate the fog of her trauma. Quilla started humming a lullaby, a simple tune she used to sing to her daughters when they were children. The melody hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. Iva looked at her, her expression shifting. A flicker of recognition sparked in her eyes, followed by a flood of suppressed emotion. "Mama?" The word was barely a whisper, a question filled with disbelief and fear. "Yes, Iva, it's me. I found you." Quilla reached out, gently touching her daughter's face. Iva flinched at the contact, then leaned into her mother's hand, a sob escaping her lips. The dam of her trauma broke, the years of suppressed pain and fear pouring out in a torrent of tears.
Quilla wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tight, rocking her gently. Iva clung to her, her body racked with sobs. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence of the warehouse broken only by the sound of Iva's weeping. Finally, Iva's sobs subsided. Pulling back, she looked at Quilla, her eyes red and swollen. "He said you were dead," she whispered. "He said everyone was dead. I am here, Iva. I never stopped looking for you." A shadow crossed Iva's face. "Where is Elizabeth?" Quilla's heart broke again. The question she had dreaded, the truth she had feared. Iva saw the answer in her mother's eyes. "No," she whispered, the denial automatic, desperate. "Iva, what happened?" Quilla asked gently, steeling herself for the answer. Iva's voice was fractured, hesitant, the words tumbling out in a torrent of horrific memories. She recounted the abduction, the sudden attack on the isolated road, the man in the dark vehicle, the struggle. Elizabeth had fought back aggressively, fiercely. She had tried to protect Iva. Bear had been enraged by her defiance. He had hit her hard, too hard. Elizabeth had fallen, hitting her head on the sharp edge of the buggy. She never woke up. Bear had panicked. He had brought them both to the brewery. Elizabeth was already dead. He had disposed of her body. Iva didn't know where. And he had kept Iva, locked her in the cold storage room for 9 years. The abuse, the isolation, the indoctrination, the forced conversion to his twisted beliefs, the rituals, the punishments, the horrific truth was laid bare, the darkness overwhelming. Quilla held Iva tight, the grief for Elizabeth mixing with the overwhelming relief of finding Iva alive. "We have to go," Quilla said, her voice urgent. "We have to get out of here before he comes back." She tried to lead Iva out of the cell, but Iva was weak, her legs trembling, paralyzed by fear. The thought of leaving the cell, the only world she had known for 9 years, was terrifying. "He will find us," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He always finds us. I won't let him hurt you any more, Iva. I promise." Quilla pulled Iva to her feet, supporting her weight. They moved toward the door, the darkness of the warehouse looming before them. Escape was imperative before Burr returned, before the window of opportunity closed. Suddenly, the warehouse was flooded with light. Headlights flashed across the interior, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The roar of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. Burr had returned. Quilla's blood ran cold. They were trapped. The slam of the car door echoed through the cavernous space as he exited the vehicle. Heavy footsteps approached the warehouse entrance. Quilla quickly pulled Iva out of the cell, extinguishing the light. Plunging back into the darkness of the warehouse, they scrambled for cover. Hiding among the towering metal brewing vats, the shadows offered a fragile shield. Quilla held Iva close, her daughter's body trembling uncontrollably. Burr entered the warehouse. He paused, scanning the darkness. He must have sensed something was wrong. The silence, the stillness. Moving toward his living space, his footsteps were loud in the emptiness. Quilla held her breath, her arm wrapped tightly around Iva. A sudden roar of rage echoed through the warehouse. Burr had found the open cell door, the cut padlock. "No!" he screamed, the sound guttural, animalistic, echoing through the vast space. The sound of destruction followed, a symphony of splintering wood and crashing metal as Burr tore apart his living space, his rage explosive, uncontrollable. Then the footsteps started again, heavy, deliberate. He was searching for them. "He's coming," Iva whispered, her voice paralyzed with terror. Quilla looked around desperately for a way out. The broken window was too far away. They would never make it without being seen. Hiding was their only option. Pulling Iva deeper into the maze of brewing vats, the towering metal structures offered a fragile degree of cover. They crouched in the shadows, the darkness enveloping them. Burr stalked through the warehouse, his movements aggressive, unpredictable, a predator seeking its prey. He ranted, his voice a low monotone, the twisted phrases of his ideology mixing with violent threats. "You can't leave," he shouted into the darkness. "You belong to me. You are nothing." He grabbed a heavy piece of metal piping from the floor, wielding it like a club. He smashed it against the metal vats, the sound deafening, a percussive beat of his escalating fury. He was getting closer. Quilla could see him now, a dark silhouette against the dim light filtering through the entrance. He moved systematically, checking behind every piece of equipment, every stack of pallets. He reached the area where they were hiding, pausing, his head tilted. "He's seen us." A guttural sound escaped his throat. He lunged toward them, the metal pipe raised high. Quilla pushed Iva behind her, shielding her with her own body. Burr swung the pipe, the metal whistling through the air. Quilla ducked, the pipe smashing against the vat behind her, the impact vibrating through the metal, a tremor of their impending doom. A desperate physical struggle ensued. Quilla fought with a primal intensity, adrenaline surging through her veins. No match for Burr's brute strength, she used the environment to her advantage. Kicking a bucket of cleaning chemicals toward him, the liquid spilled onto the floor, creating a treacherous, slippery surface. Burr slipped, stumbling backward, his movements clumsy, uncertain. Quilla seized the moment, pulling down a stack of unstable equipment. The metal crashed onto the floor, creating a temporary barrier between them. Burr roars in frustration, his rage escalating, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred as he lunged at her again. Quilla saw an opportunity. A large, unstable fermentation vat towered over them, its metal frame rusted and corroded. It was a gamble, a desperate act of defiance. As Burr lunged, Quilla shoved the vat with all her strength. The metal groaned, resisting, but she pushed harder, the muscles in her arms burning. The vat began to tilt, slowly at first, then accelerating with terrifying momentum. Burr looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He tried to scramble back, but it was too late. The vat toppled over, crashing onto him with a deafening roar. The heavy metal pinned him to the ground, the impact shaking the entire warehouse. Burr screams, the sound cut short by the crushing weight. He was trapped, incapacitated. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Quilla stared at the wreckage, the horrific realization of what she had done sinking in. Grabbing Eva's hand, she urged, "Come on, we have to go now." They fled the warehouse, running through the darkness, the sound of Burr's muffled groans fading behind them. They didn't look back, not once. They ran into the night, toward the distant lights of the town, toward freedom. They ran until their legs gave out, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. Reaching a nearby road, the asphalt was rough beneath their feet. The night was quiet, the stillness a stark contrast to the violence they had just escaped. Eva was stumbling, her weakness overwhelming her. Quilla supported her weight, her arm wrapped tightly around her daughter's waist. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. A large truck, its engine rumbling in the profound silence. Stepping onto the road, Quilla waved her arms frantically. The truck slowed, its air brakes hissing as it came to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, leaned out of the window. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "We need help," Quilla said, her voice raw. "We need a phone. We need the police." The driver saw their state, the ragged clothing, the filth, the stark terror in their eyes. His expression shifted from weariness to alarm. Climbing down from the cab, he pulled a cell phone from his pocket. "What happened?" "A man held us captive," Quilla explained, the words feeling surreal, utterly inadequate. "In the abandoned brewery down the road." Using the driver's phone, she called Detective Russo. The phone rang several times before he answered, his voice gruff, sleepy. "Russo," he said. "It's Quilla Vout. I found her. I found Iva." A stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What? Where are you?" Quilla gave him the location, the details tumbling out in a torrent of fragmented sentences. The brewery, Burr, the cell, the fight. "He's trapped," she finished, her voice trembling. "Under a vat. He's injured but alive." Sharp alert. "Stay where you are," Russo ordered, his voice sharp, alert now. "I'm sending units to your location and to the brewery. Don't move." The wait was agonizing. Quilla held Iva tight, the reality of their escape slowly sinking in. They were safe. They were free. The police arrived moments later, the flashing lights painting the darkness in shades of red and blue. Paramedics followed, their movements efficient, professional. Iva was gently loaded onto a stretcher, her body limp with exhaustion. Quilla stayed by her side, holding her hand as they were transported to the local hospital. Sunrise found them in a sterile hospital room. Iva was admitted for severe malnutrition, dehydration, and comprehensive physical and psychological evaluation. She was asleep, the deep, restful sleep of the truly exhausted. Sitting by her bedside, Quilla watched her daughter sleep. Iva looked fragile, broken, the years of captivity etched on her face. But she was alive. She was safe. The emotional weight of the reunion was immense. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tinged with a profound sadness. The truth about Elizabeth, the confirmation of her death, hit Quilla with full force. One daughter found, but the other lost forever. Finally, she allowed herself to grieve. The tears came silently, tracing paths through the grime on her face. The pain of the loss was sharp, visceral, but it was also a release, a confirmation of the truth she had denied herself for 9 years. Detective Russo arrived later that morning, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You did it, Mrs. Vout," he said quietly. "You saved her." "She saved herself," Quilla corrected, her voice tired but firm. Russo updated her on the situation. Bear had been extracted from the wreckage and taken into custody. Severely injured, but he would survive to face justice. The brewery was now an active crime scene. The investigation had just begun. Quilla listened, the details feeling distant, unimportant. The only thing that mattered was Iva. The fight wasn't over. The escape was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, arduous. Iva was deeply traumatized. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones. The process of healing, of deprogramming the years of abuse and indoctrination, would be a monumental challenge. A new purpose became clear to Quilla. 9 years had been spent searching for her daughters. Now the rest of her life would be dedicated to helping Iva heal, helping her reconnect with the world she was forced to leave behind, helping her find her way back to herself. She looked at Iva, sleeping peacefully in the hospital bed. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the window, illuminating her face. A faint smile touched her lips. The darkness had been overwhelming, but it had not extinguished the light. Hope remained, fragile but persistent. The journey had just begun.
The scene at the brewery was organized chaos. Police tactical teams swarmed the warehouse, flashing lights reflecting off the metal siding. The air was thick with the smell of yeast and decay, the atmosphere heavy with the darkness of what had occurred within these walls. Russo oversaw the operation, the satisfaction of the arrest overshadowed by the horrific reality of Iva's captivity. Kenton Burr, severely injured but conscious, had been extracted from beneath the fermentation vat. He was belligerent, uncooperative, his rants filled with the same twisted ideology found on the warehouse walls. He was transported to the hospital under heavy guard. The search of the warehouse began immediately. The forensic team, clad in protective suits, moved through the cluttered space, documenting everything. The cell where Iva had been held captive was the primary focus. The horrific conditions, the filth, the despair. It was a testament to the depth of Burr's depravity. The search expanded to the rest of the warehouse. In Burr's makeshift living quarters, evidence confirming his obsession with the Amish community was found. His hatred and resentment laid bare in his writings and belongings. And then they found the items that confirmed the horrific truth of Elizabeth Vought's fate. Hidden in a locked metal box, buried beneath a pile of discarded equipment, a small collection of personal items was discovered. A silver locket tarnished with age, a hand-carved wooden bird, a faded blue ribbon. Quilla identified them later that day. They had belonged to Elizabeth. The discovery confirmed Iva's fragmented account of the abduction. Elizabeth had been murdered, her body disposed of. The search for her remains began, the vast wilderness surrounding the brewery presenting a daunting challenge. The investigation widened. The evidence found in the warehouse, the writings, the specific items, also linked Burr definitively to the disappearance and murder of Sarah Stoltz in Pennsylvania. The scope of his crimes spanned over a decade. His targeted hatred and psychological manipulation were more extensive than they had imagined. Kenton Burr was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, aggravated assault, and long-term abuse. The case was airtight, the evidence overwhelming. Justice would be served. The news of the arrest and the confirmation of Elizabeth's death spread quickly through the settlement. The reaction was a mixture of relief, grief, and shame. Quilla returned briefly to her community, leaving Iva in the care of the hospital staff. A proper memorial service for Elizabeth was needed to acknowledge her death, to honor her memory. The service was held in the community cemetery, a simple plot of land overlooking the valley. The entire community attended, the silence heavy with shared grief. Bishop Yodar approached Quilla after the service, his expression humbled, remorseful. "Sister Quilla," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We were wrong. We urged acceptance when action was needed. We prioritized peace over justice. We failed you." The realization that their previous judgment and reluctance to act had allowed the evil to fester was a bitter pill to swallow. Quilla looked at him, her gaze steady. "I did what I had to do." The community embraced her, offering support and solidarity. The isolation she had felt, the conflict between her faith and her determination, dissolved in the face of the shared tragedy. They pledged to support her and Iva in the long journey of healing that lay ahead. Returning to the hospital, Quilla's heart was heavy with grief, but also filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The past was buried, the truth revealed. The future was uncertain, but it was a future she would face together with Iva. Months later, the seasons shifted. The vibrant colors of autumn faded into the muted tones of winter. Iva was transferred to a specialized long-term trauma care facility, a quiet retreat nestled in the hills, far from the darkness of the brewery. The healing process was slow, arduous. The years of abuse, indoctrination, had left deep scars, both physical and psychological. Iva was withdrawn, barely verbal, her days filled with therapy sessions and quiet reflection. The process of deprogramming the rituals and beliefs forced upon her by Burr was a monumental challenge. She struggled to reconcile the twisted ideology that had governed her life for 9 years with the reality of the world she was slowly reconnecting with.
Quilla remained steadfastly by her side. Moving into a small apartment near the facility, her life revolved around Iva's recovery. A constant presence, she was a source of comfort and stability in the turbulent sea of Iva's trauma. She bridged the gap between the life Iva had lost and the future she now faced. Familiar items from the farm were brought: a quilt made by Elizabeth, a wooden bowl carved by her father, the scent of lavender and beeswax. Speaking to Iva in Pennsylvania Dutch, the familiar language was a balm to her wounded soul. Reading to her, singing to her, these simple acts of love and connection slowly broke through the walls of her trauma. Progress was measured in small victories: a shared smile, a spontaneous memory, a moment of connection. The trial of Kenton Burr took place during this time. Quilla attended every day, her presence a silent testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. Burr was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of closure, a confirmation that justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain, the loss, the years of suffering. The healing continued. One afternoon, Quilla brought a quilting frame to the facility. Setting it up in the common room, the colorful fabrics were a vibrant splash of color in the sterile environment. Sitting down at the frame, her movements were methodical, practiced. She started quilting, the needle weaving through the fabric, creating intricate patterns. Iva watched her, her expression curious. Approaching the frame, her hand reached out to touch the fabric. "Do you remember?" Quilla asked gently. "We used to quilt together, you and Elizabeth." Iva nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Quilla handed her a needle and thread. "Would you like to try?" she asked encouragingly. Iva hesitated, then took the needle, her hand trembling slightly. She sat down beside Quilla, the quilting frame between them, focusing on the fabric, the needle poised above the surface. She took a deep breath. Then she pushed the needle through the fabric, completing a single stitch. It was a small, imperfect stitch, but it was a beginning. Quilla looked at her daughter, her heart filled with a profound love and a fragile hope.
The road ahead was long, the healing incomplete, but they were together, and they were moving forward, one stitch at a time.